In Unit 9, we're going to talk about triads in first inversion. When you invert a chord, it means that you're taking your chord and you're going to put a note other than the root of the triad in the bass voice. Our example triad is a 1 chord in the key of D. We have D, F sharp, and A, and this is an example of how we have been voicing chords in root position. So I have D, A, F sharp, and D. If I were to invert this triad and have a note other than the root in the bass voice, that's going to cause us to have an inversion. In our second example here, I have F sharp in the bass, which is the third of your triad. When you have the third of your triad in the bass voice, that means you're going to be in first inversion. And that's what we'll be talking about for the rest of this unit. It's important, however, to just make a mental note of second inversion, and that's when you have the fifth of your triad in the bass voice. In this case, it would be A natural. In traditional part writing, chords and their inversions are often labeled using a system known as figured bass. The example that I've shown you here is a fully figured bass. Each of these numbers represents an interval distance from a note in the chord to the bass note. For example, the distance between D and our soprano is an octave, hence we have an 8. The distance between D and our A there is a fifth, and hence we have a 5, and then the distance between D and F sharp is a third. Now, the order of these notes up here doesn't really matter. It doesn't have to go octave, fifth, third, as long as those intervals are present, and they can also be compound intervals as well, kind of like how our octave is a compound octave. Oftentimes, when you see this root position chord, we're going to simplify it and take away those numbers. They're all implied. So if you ever see a chord that's simply labeled with the Roman numeral, like this, you can assume that it is a root position chord. All right, let's look at our first inversion chord. The fully figured bass is labeled with a 6 and a 3. Our D, both of them, are a sixth away from the bass. Obviously, from soprano to bass, that's a compound sixth, but it's still a sixth. And our A is a third, compound third away from our bass, hence we get the 6-3. Oftentimes in part writing, however, we're going to abbreviate that to just a 6. And so this, using a Roman numeral, would be labeled 1-6. Lastly, we have our second inversion chord, and this is going to show us the intervals of a sixth and a fourth above the bass. In this case, we have the sixth above the bass being our F, and we have the fourth above the bass being the D in both the tenor and the soprano voice. And this, when we label it with a Roman numeral, we will have both the 6 and the 4 to differentiate between the first inversion chord. So it's going to be labeled 1-6-4. Now put this in the back of your mind. We're going to get to it in the next unit. For the rest of Unit 9, let's go ahead and just focus on root position and first inversion chords. All right, let's try using the first inversion triad in practice. In this example, we're in the key of F major, and we're going from a 1 chord to a first inversion 5 chord, or a 5-6 chord, back to a 1 chord. Now in general, with first inversion triads, you want to follow the same basic rules of doubling. So almost always you're going to want to double the root of your triad. Occasionally you can double the fifth as well, but still stay away from doubling the third. Alright, so we have our root position 1 chord. And notice that we still are keeping a common tone going into our 5 chord. And C, which is the root of this chord, is doubled, which is good. Another thing to make note of when you're part writing using first inversion chords is that at least one of your voices should move in the opposite direction of the bass. Not necessarily by step, but by step would be good. You always want to go for the smoothest possible line. To recap, when you're working with first inversion triads, you almost always want to double the root, but sometimes it's appropriate to double the fifth. You also still want to keep a common tone between your previous chord and the next chord if possible. And then you want at least one voice to move in the opposite direction of the bass.